Okay, today I want to go through a little bit about dynos, and a little bit about there's essentially some different forms of dynos, and what most people seem to be not aware of is that different dynos give different readings. We'll come over to the other side here and we'll show what our dyno is, which is really run-of-the-mill, normal sort of dyno, and really the sort of horsepower that most of us understand and speak. Now this is called a retarder dyno. It has essentially two rollers, a traction roller on the front and then an idler roller on the back. There's actually four of them, two for each wheel. In some cases you'll just have one big front one and one long back one. In most cases you'll have separate rollers on either side. This style of dyno is probably the most common in Australia. It's called a retarder dyno because essentially on this front, which is the driven roller, it has a pair of electronic retarders. The way the dyno works is that it has essentially electronic motors, or the opposite of motors, like electronic brakes, that actually resist this resist this roller, and then with the amount of power the engine's got, or the back wheels have got, pushing against these front rollers, is essentially then electronically, or the computer works out what horsepower that is. There's a fair few equations, there's different compensation factors, all sorts of things, but we come to a fairly standard of what we use in Australia on that side of things. One of the factors that a lot of people don't understand about these dynos, which means you don't always get exactly the same reading, is different tyres, like this. This is a 22-inch rim, very small tyre. It has at X amount of horsepower it has an advantage, and that's a lower horsepower it tends to have an advantage because it's got such a small sidewall. It actually takes less energy to roll, and you can understand that in the equation of we've all ridden a 10-speed push bike, or essentially a bike with very skinny tyres, and how that'll roll down the road easy. That's a lot easier to travel on. Or you sit on your BMX bike, or you sit on your all-terrain tyres, big fat tyres. As much as they're good at going across the dirt, they take a lot more energy to drive down the road. And that's essentially a larger, bigger tyre takes more energy to roll over. A little skinny tyre like this takes less energy to roll over. The drawback is once you get to X amount of horsepower, there's less sidewall, there's less ability for the tyre to flex and actually change shape around the front roller. So at a certain amount of horsepower, a certain amount of torque, we start to struggle with traction. So then essentially I can get more complicated, explaining the sort of tyres that do better or worse, but essentially they do change. Not just in sizes, but also different tyres take different energy, different tyre pressures, all those sorts of things can vary our reading because we are actually measuring between the tyre and the roller. That's a basic summation of that. The next thing I'd like to say is that there's a couple of different forms of dyno beyond that point. I should say, with the rolling road, the way we use a rolling road is to try and set, with this sort of dyno, we try and set it up where the tyres are able to go forward. Not too much. If you have them ramp too fast and too far forward, you'll find that you'll essentially get slightly higher horsepower readings because of inertia compensation than dyno. But equally, if you hold them back too much, you'll get lower readings. And essentially, once in the high horsepower stuff, a lot of what we do in the 600 horsepower and plus, you essentially don't get proper traction. You've got to let the tyre forward onto the roller to get that. So the way we do our job is to work out, to try and get it to come forward the right amount to give a reading that makes sense of what the car is. And as a rule, that's pretty simple. In some places, they do read a little bit funny. And you have to actually adjust how you're tying them down to make sure you're getting a proper reading. It takes a fair bit of experience to get that stuff right, and it's one of the things that you will see where it gets a little bit weird or a little bit the wrong sort of readings because that isn't actually set up properly. Okay, beyond that, I'd explain that essentially, as I said, this is the most common in Australia. There's a couple of different forms of dyno. One which is a little bit more American, a little bit more an older way of doing it, which is called an inertia dyno. You'll see them on videos of drag cars on videos where essentially they have a really big round drum that's sitting in the ground, which is the big roller, which will be up to 6 feet in diameter. And essentially those are essentially inertia dynos. They work in a different fashion. They are heavy drums that essentially use the X amount of energy to make them spin. So the more horsepower you have, the faster you'll get them to spin. They simply read how fast they spin, and then those dynos work out what horsepower that is. Those dynos, it is not so easy to tune on those dynos, much more used for drag racing, that sort of stuff. A bit more common in America, although we do have them over here in Australia. The one factor that is commonly misunderstood is that the majority of those dynos read quite differently. And you're talking, and it's only an estimation, but essentially around 13% different. And that means that essentially if you have a 1,000 horsepower car that reads 1,000 horsepower on one of these retarded dynos, you're going to read around the 1,150 horsepower. In actual fact, even more, up to 1,300 horsepower is what you'll read out of that same car on an inertia dyno, or the big drum rollers. So the one I really wanted to talk about, that I'm getting a fair few questions about, is essentially called the hub dyno. Now the hub dynos, mainline, the same company as this here. There's a few other places, but the mainline one is the one that's coming in at the moment. And the way that works is quite different. It has all essentially the same electronics. What it does, instead of having rollers, is it essentially takes the rear wheels off and it bolts onto the actual hub. So it actually bolts onto the hub, and you have one big retarder on one side, and you do the same on the other side. Jack the vehicle up, and it actually sits on its hubs. Now, the large advantage that those dynos have is that they don't have any wheel losses. So you don't have to worry. One of the things I should mention is that the average tyre, not that sort of tyre, but the average tyre that we're running on uses about 40 horsepower. Our rear wheel reading is around 40 horsepower lower because of the horsepower that the tyre uses to roll. That's how much horsepower it's roughly taking. It varies on different tyres have different energy, but it uses roughly 40 horsepower. That is before we start talking about slip. At 300, 350 rear wheel horsepower, so from 100 to 350 rear wheel horsepower, slip isn't a major issue. It's really, there's not that much involved there, but you still use that amount of energy to turn tyres. So that means that if you had a 300 horsepower car and you measured it on a rolling road, it's going to measure 300 rear wheel horsepower. If you had essentially, you put that same car onto a hub dyno, it's probably going to read roughly 340 rear wheel horsepower. I should say, I mentioned there 300 horsepower car, I'm talking rear wheel horsepower. There's another conversation to describe engine horsepower versus rear wheel horsepower because of drivetrain losses, but we won't confuse it with that today. The factor where the hub dyno changes things quite a bit is once you move into wheel spin, so wheel slip. And essentially you can, there isn't a proper number. It really depends on your tyres, it really depends on its setup, but there is cases where a car that ran 1200 rear wheel horsepower on a rolling road runs 1700 horsepower on a hub dyno. It's really talking about, that's a little bit of an exceptional situation, but that's the amount of wheel slip that was actually being involved. There's tyre energy as well, but it's largely the amount of wheel slip that was involved. As a rule, and I shouldn't say as a rule, but as an approximation as to what seems to be fairly common, is you're looking at around the 10%. So that means if you have a 400 rear wheel kilowatt car, so that means you're making just under the 550, the 530 rear wheel horsepower, and that's what it's running on a rolling road, or this retarder style dyno. If you put that straight onto a hub dyno, it's going to run around 10% more. So the 400 rear wheel kilowatt car is going to run 440 rear wheel kilowatts. Some cases a little bit more, it's more in the 13%, but that's a big difference. It doesn't mean the machine reads any differently at all. What it's simply talking about is there's no tyre frictional losses and there's no tyre slip losses that you're talking about. I suppose the summation of what I'm actually saying is that dynos are not a set measurement. People think that if I've got 561 horsepower on this dyno, I should have it everywhere. It isn't the case. A dyno's, the best job of a dyno, what it does best is before and after readings. The reading you're going to get in the way of one dyno to another dyno has, especially with a retarder style dyno, has strapping down differences. You certainly change your tyres, you can have differences there. There's all subtle differences on that point. There is less differences between one hub dyno to another dyno because there isn't any tyre losses, there isn't any traction issues, there isn't any tie down issues, but they are quite a big bit of difference from the speak that we're used to. So essentially, if you have a car that was making 600 horsepower at the rear wheels on a hub dyno, it's a car that is probably making around the 530 to 550 rear wheels on our old way of talking, which is with these mainline dynos and the dyno dynamic dynos that we're all used to, it's a different number. It's around the 10 to 13% different. So that's a lot of words. I hope that clears things up a little bit and tries to make sense of what's actually going on there. Nothing wrong with the dynos, they're a great dyno, very accurate. There's just a different number we're actually talking about, which has to be put in reference or in relevance to what we're actually talking about.